Victor Reed accelerated as rain violently pounded the windshield of his car. The wipers fought in vain against the storm, reflecting what he felt inside, a desperate struggle to maintain clarity amid unstoppable chaos. His chest ached, each breath growing heavier, as if the weight of the secrets he had just uncovered was crushing him entirely. He didn't know exactly where he was headed, but he knew he couldn't stay a second longer. His family's legacy was collapsing around him, and he refused to be dragged down with it. The phone on the passenger seat buzzed incessantly. He knew who was on the other end. His father. His mother. Maybe his brother. All of them wanting to know where he was, demanding an explanation for his sudden disappearance. But he couldn't face them, not after what he had discovered that morning. The documents he had accidentally found in his father's office left no room for doubt. The Reed family, the untouchable magnates, had built their empire on lies, corruption, and human suffering. Worse still, their shady dealings had devastated entire communities, reducing them to ruins. Victor gritted his teeth and pressed harder on the accelerator. The highway was empty, dark, like the future awaiting him. Fear pulsed in his chest, but what tormented him most was guilt. He had lived a life of privilege without questioning where all the luxuries came from. How had he been so blind? All his life, he had been taught the value of hard work and honesty, and now all of that crumbled before his eyes, revealing the truth. His family had not only amassed their fortune through illicit means but had destroyed lives in the process. Innocent people. People like Sophia Harper. Her name pierced his mind like a dagger. Sophia. Her story was just one of many, but it was the one that haunted him the most. He had read reports about how his father's company had wiped out small farmers' lands to build real estate projects. One of those farmers was Sophia's father, who had lost everything, leading to his downfall and then to his grave. Sophia, once a promising academic, had been forced to abandon her studies, drowning in debt and despair. Now she lived in a small town, far from luxury, rebuilding the pieces of her life. Victor knew he couldn't change the past. But he wanted to be better than his family. His decision had been swift, almost instinctive. He had left everything behind, adopted a new identity, and taken refuge in the very town where Sophia lived, though she had no idea. Now he was David Miller, a simple man looking for a fresh start as a driver in that quiet place, far from the poison of the Reeds. But the irony suffocated him. He had sought refuge in the same place his family had devastated. As his car left the highway and entered a smaller road, surrounded by dark, deserted fields, the weight of his past continued to hang over him like a storm cloud. He didn't know how long he could keep up the facade. How much longer could he hide who he really was? And what would he do when Sophia found out the truth? The rain began to subside, but inside him, the storm still raged. It had only been a week since he had settled into the town, but with each passing day, he felt like he was walking on a tightrope. Sophia was kind, a resilient woman who had endured more than anyone should. Their conversations were simple, about life in the town, about small everyday pleasures. She had no idea who he was or what his family had done. And yet, he already felt himself falling in love with her. That thought horrified him. How could he dare to feel something for her, after everything he had taken from her? But he couldn't help it. Sophia was different. Her smile, despite the pain she carried, had a sincerity Victor had never seen in the superficial world he had grown up in. With each passing day, he admired her more, and with that, his guilt grew exponentially. The phone buzzed once again, this time with a text message. He didn't read it. He didn't want to hear anything more from his family, but the thought that they would soon find him haunted him. They wouldn't give up easily. His father, in particular, would never accept one of his own rebelling against the empire he had built. Victor knew his days were numbered before they found him, before everything came crashing down again. But that night, as he turned off the car in front of the small cabin he now called home, he made a silent promise. For the first time in his life, he was going to do the right thing. Not for his family, not for their legacy, but for the people who had suffered because of the Reeds. He would do it for Sophia. The creak of the door opening broke the night's silence. Inside, the cabin was modest but cozy. On the table in the living room, a small lamp flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls. Victor sank into a chair, exhaling deeply. He was tired. Tired of the lies, the expectations, the constant facade. And though he still didn't know how, he had to find a way to tell Sophia the truth, even if it meant losing her forever. The guilt was unbearable, but what terrified him most wasn't the punishment he might face for his family's crimes. What he feared most was the disgust in Sophia's eyes when she finally learned who he was. He feared that more than anything else. As he closed his eyes, surrendering to exhaustion, he knew the truth couldn't be hidden forever. The question wasn't if they would find out, but when. And when that day came, everything would change. Forever. David Miller, formerly known as Victor Reed, watched from inside his car as Sophia Harper walked toward the small-town grocery store. The afternoon sun illuminated her hair, and she walked with a calm that contradicted everything she had been through. Her strength drew him in, but it also tormented him. How could she be so strong while he could barely maintain his facade? Each passing day, he felt more mired in a swamp of lies and guilt. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening from the force. He was just a few yards away from her. He could call out to her, offer her a ride as he had done several times since he had taken the job as a driver. But the very thought of speaking to her, of seeing her smile at him, knowing what he and his family had taken from her, paralyzed him. He was playing with fire, and each time he got close to Sophia, he felt the flames rising closer to his skin. The phone buzzed again, this time with a text message. He pulled it out of his pocket and, with a heavy sigh, read the name on the screen, unknown. He knew exactly who it was. You can't hide forever. Come back before it gets worse. It was one of the many messages he had been receiving over the past few days, each more threatening than the last. His family was looking for him, and not out of concern. His father would never accept that the only son capable of inheriting the Reed Empire had disappeared for moral reasons. Control and greed were his father's defining traits, and both clashed violently with the idea of losing power, even if it meant sacrificing his own son. David knew his days in the town were numbered. If his family found him, they would drag him back to his old life, regardless of what he wanted. The Reed's connections ran deep, and his father was known to use any method, however dirty, to maintain control. But he couldn't run again. Not without doing something for the people his family had destroyed, especially Sophia. Sophia! She emerged from the grocery store with a small bag in hand, walking with a determined yet calm step. David watched her with a mix of admiration and fear. Every interaction they had sank him deeper into guilt. There were times when, while chatting, he almost felt like he could tell her everything. But he knew that the moment he did, everything would change. She would hate him. And rightly so. He decided that he wouldn't speak to her that day. He started the car and headed toward the opposite end of town, away from the temptation that gnawed at him inside. However, as he drove down the dusty road, his thoughts swirled uncontrollably. The tension consumed him, and the feeling that everything was about to collapse grew more palpable by the minute. The first sign that things were about to get complicated appeared that very afternoon. As David parked his car in front of the small cabin he now called home, he saw a black, luxurious car parked nearby. His heart stopped. A man was leaning against the vehicle, smoking a cigarette with the nonchalance of someone who had everything under control. David recognized him instantly. It was Marcus Henley, his father's right-hand man, the go-to for the dirty work. If Marcus was there, it meant his family already knew where he was, and worse, that things were about to get much worse. David Miller, Marcus raised his gaze, smirking mockingly as he exhaled cigarette smoke. Or should I say, Victor Reed. What a surprise to see you in such humble surroundings. David stepped out of the car slowly, his body on high alert. Marcus was dangerous. Not just because of his unwavering loyalty to his father, but because he enjoyed his work. He loved having control, especially when he could exert pressure on the weak. David knew that any wrong move could betray his fear. "What are you doing here, Marcus?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Come on, Victor," Marcus replied, crushing the cigarette underfoot and walking toward him with a smug smile. "You can't seriously be living this farce of a simple man in a forgotten town. Your father wants you back. We all want you back." David kept his gaze steady, though inside he felt the ground beneath his feet crumble. "I'm not going back. You know why I left." Marcus's smile faded for a moment, but his eyes gleamed with malice. "Of course, I know. You think you're a hero, don't you?" Marcus stopped right in front of him, his voice lowering, more menacing. "But you can't escape who you are. You can't fix what we did, or redeem yourself by playing at being a peasant. And you know it." David felt a lump in his throat. He knew Marcus was partly right, and that was the worst part of it all. No matter how much he tried to redeem himself, the damage was already done. But he couldn't go back. Not after everything he had discovered. "Tell my father I'm not coming back. And if I'm forced to, I'll talk." The danger in his words was clear. It was a threat that would change everything. Marcus stood silent for a moment, as if measuring him. Then he smiled again, this time with an expression that made it clear things were not going to end well. "You choose, Victor. But don't do something you'll regret." Without another word, Marcus turned and got into the black car. The engine roared, and it disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust. The warning had been given. And if there was one thing David knew for certain, it was that his father never made empty threats. The internal conflict intensifies. That night, David couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marcus's smirk, knowing he didn't have much time left. But more than the fear for his safety, it was the fear of being found out that ate away at him. In the days that followed, he avoided Sophia as much as possible. The few times they crossed paths, he made excuses not to talk much, keeping his distance. But each day he didn't see her, the guilt and desperation built up inside him like a storm. In the small town, rumors began to grow. Some neighbors looked at him with curiosity, others with suspicion. He was an outsider, after all, and his arrival had been sudden. It didn't help that every now and then, luxury cars like Marcus's were spotted parked on the outskirts, though no one dared to ask questions. One day, while David was working on a neighbor's car, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He quickly turned and found himself staring into the dark eyes of John Bailey, a burly, quiet man, but one who was respected in the community. John was a close friend of Sophia's, and although he wasn't one to meddle in other people's affairs, David noticed a look of distrust in him. "You've been distant lately, David," John commented, narrowing his eyes. "People are starting to talk. Are you okay?" David tried to stay calm, but John's words made him realize something. His facade was beginning to crumble. "I'm fine, just busy," he replied quickly, almost mechanically. John studied him for a few more seconds, as if trying to see through him. Finally, he nodded, but his tone remained cold. "Sophia's worried about you. Maybe you should talk to her before it's too late." John's comment was blunt, and David felt a pang in his heart. He knew he had to face her, but fear paralyzed him. He knew that the longer he waited, the more painful the truth would be when it finally came to light. One step toward the abyss, the imminent decision. With each passing day, the tension mounted. The fear of being discovered, the pressure from his family, and his growing feelings for Sophia consumed him. And he knew time was running out. He couldn't run anymore. But how could he face Sophia, knowing he was part of the reason for her suffering? How could he look her in the eyes and tell her the truth without her hating him forever? Finally, he made a decision. That same evening, as the sun began to set and the air was thick with the humidity of the rain, he decided he would go to see her. He couldn't keep hiding anymore, not from his past, nor from the truth. With his heart pounding, he walked up to the small house where she lived. Upon arrival, he saw a light in the window and knew she was home. A knot tightened in his stomach. With each step toward the door, it felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath him. Finally, he raised his hand to knock, but guilt stopped him again. What if he told her the truth and lost her forever? What would be the point of his redemption if Sophia rejected him, despised him for what he had done? Before he could decide whether to knock or not, the door opened, and there she stood. Her kind, warm eyes looked at him with a mix of surprise and concern. "David, is everything okay?" And there it was. The opportunity to confess everything. To tell her the truth, to face his mistakes. But the words stuck in his throat, trapped by fear. Because, deep down, he knew that telling the truth would mean losing her forever. And at that moment, he wasn't sure he could bear it. David Miller, formerly known as Victor Reed, remained frozen at Sophia's door. The truth was on the verge of escaping his lips, but fear paralyzed him. Sophia's eyes, always warm and filled with a calmness that disarmed him, gazed at him expectantly. There was concern on her face, and that cut him deeply. He knew she could sense something. She knew that his distance, his erratic behavior in recent days, had raised suspicions. But how could he tell her that he was part of the reason for her suffering? "David, what's going on?" Sophia repeated, this time more firmly. She wasn't one to remain silent. If there was anything he had learned from their conversations, it was that Sophia didn't settle for half-truths. David swallowed, struggling with the words that threatened to choke him. He wanted to confess everything, but guilt and the fear of losing her stole his breath. At that moment, he made a cowardly decision, one he knew he would pay for later, but not now. "I'm fine," he finally murmured, forcing a smile onto his face. "I've just been overwhelmed." The tension surrounding him didn't disappear, but Sophia seemed to accept it, at least for now. She nodded, though her eyes still searched for answers he couldn't give. Without saying another word, she offered him to come inside, and David, after a pause, did so. The warmth of the house and Sophia's closeness temporarily comforted him, but inside, the weight of the truth suffocated him. He knew he couldn't hide it much longer. The storm looming over him, and Sophia, was drawing ever nearer. The following weeks were a delicate balance between fear and a pretense of normalcy. David continued working as a driver, helping the neighbors, and above all, growing closer to Sophia. Every conversation with her trapped him deeper into a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't control. He admired her strength, and despite the guilt eating him up inside, he couldn't help but feel drawn to her. Each day he spent by her side made him wish he could be someone else, someone worthy of her affection. However, the shadow of his past still loomed, and with it, Marcus Henley. The man had reappeared in town, this time more brazen than before. He made sure to be seen at every corner, watching with a perverse smile as David tried to maintain his secret life. Marcus didn't confront him directly, but his presence was a constant threat. Every time David saw him on the streets or in the town's cafe, the knot in his stomach tightened. It was only a matter of time before Marcus stopped playing and decided to ruin him completely. And then came the day when everything began to fall apart. Sophia had invited David to a small gathering at her home to celebrate the renovation of her garden. It had been a hard-fought project that she had completed with the help of a few neighbors. David knew how important this achievement was to her, a symbol of how she was rebuilding her life. He arrived early to her house, helping with the preparations, and for the first time in a long while, everything seemed calm. But that calm was just the prelude to the storm. The night went on, and the small celebration continued with laughter and light conversations, but David couldn't relax. He felt a latent tension, something he couldn't quite identify, as if the air was charged with electricity. Then he saw him. Marcus. The man was there, mingling with the crowd. Smiling. Calm, as if he were in control of everything. David felt his heart stop. What was Marcus doing at the party? Why would he dare cross that line? The danger was now so close to Sophia it was tangible. He tried to mask his reaction, but Marcus approached before he could escape the situation. With a twisted smile, Marcus greeted him loud enough for Sophia to hear. David. What a surprise to see you here. David felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't what Marcus said, but how he said it. There was venom in every word, a threat disguised as courtesy. Sophia, who was standing next to David, looked at Marcus with a confused expression. Do we know each other? She asked, addressing Marcus with the kindness she always showed. Marcus feigned a kind smile. Oh no, I don't think we've been introduced. I'm an old acquaintance of David's, or should I say, Victor. The name fell like a bomb. Victor. David felt the world stop for a moment. The air in his lungs disappeared, and everything slowed down. He had known this moment would come, but he wasn't prepared for the impact. Sophia, on the other hand, didn't react immediately. She blinked, confused, clearly not understanding what Marcus had just said. Victor? Sophia asked, turning her gaze to David. What is he talking about? David tried to respond, to come up with a quick lie that might get him out of this situation, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of the truth crushed him. Before he could say anything, Marcus continued, enjoying the spectacle. Oh, he didn't tell you, did he? Marcus looked at him with a predatory smile. David Miller is just a fake name. His real name is Victor Reed. Yes, the son of the corrupt magnate. You might have heard of his family, you know, the one that destroyed your father's life. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia stood frozen, her eyes fixed on David, as if she couldn't process what she had just heard. The name Reed echoed in her mind, clashing with the image she had built of David. The man who had been by her side for months, who had made her feel comfortable, maybe even trusting, now revealed himself as part of the same family that had caused her father's ruin and her own. No. Sophia finally whispered, shaking her head as if trying to undo what she had just heard. It can't be. No, you can't be. David opened his mouth to speak, but the betrayal had already taken place. No matter what he said now, the truth was out, and Sophia was devastated. Sophia, He began, stepping toward her, but she stepped back, raising a hand to stop him. The pain in her eyes was unbearable. How could you? Sophia's broken voice hit him like a dagger. How could you come near me, knowing what your family did to me? Knowing what they took from me? David felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. His worst fear had come true. Sophia didn't just hate him, she despised him. And the worst part was that she was right. He had lied from the beginning. He had come to her, knowing he was part of the destruction that had devastated her life. Sophia, please, let me explain. He tried again, but she no longer wanted to hear it. No. I don't want to hear anything else. Her words were sharp, cutting. You're just like them. The crowd at the party watched in silence, stunned by the scene. The neighbors whispered among themselves, unable to believe what they were witnessing. David was no longer David. Now he was Victor Reed, the son of the man who had destroyed lives to build his empire. And then, Sophia delivered the final blow. I want you to leave. Her voice was cold, firm. I don't ever want to see you again. David stood frozen, the world collapsing around him. Everything he had tried to build, everything he had tried to repair, had crumbled in a single instant. There was nothing more he could say. He had run out of options. He had lost Sophia forever. Realizing that insisting would only make things worse, he nodded slowly and took a step back. The guilt consumed him. He knew this was his fault, and he couldn't blame her for hating him. As he walked away, he felt Marcus's mocking gaze burning into his back. The man had won. Marcus had exposed the truth, and now David was alone, no friends, no allies, and no hope. David didn't have time to process what had happened. He had barely made it back to his cabin, feeling utterly destroyed, when his phone rang. This time, it wasn't a threatening message from his family. It was a call from an unknown number. Something was wrong. He answered with trembling hands, and what he heard left him paralyzed. A cold, emotionless voice spoke from the other end of the line. "We know who you are. And we're going to make you pay for what your family did. You have 48 hours to leave town, or we'll make sure you regret ever coming here." David remained silent, unable to speak. It wasn't his family. It wasn't Marcus. It was someone else, someone who also knew his identity and was ready to destroy him if he didn't flee. The revelation hit him like a sledgehammer. Not only had he lost Sophia, but now someone else was hunting him. David Miller, no, Victor Reed, was on the verge of collapse. After the devastating revelation at Sophia's party, his world lay in ruins. Marcus's words and the look of absolute pain in Sophia's eyes played on repeat in his mind, like an endless echo that wouldn't leave him alone. His identity had been exposed, and with it, the fragile balance he had tried to maintain in his life had crumbled. The man he was trying to be, the man he aspired to become, had vanished in an instant. The mysterious phone call he had received that same night had only made things worse. "We know who you are. You have 48 hours to leave town or face the consequences." Those words echoed in his mind as he paced back and forth in his small cabin. Fear had kept him awake all night. He couldn't run again, but he also knew that staying would put him in danger. Now, not only were his family and Marcus hunting him, but also an unknown enemy, someone willing to take extreme measures to destroy him. Time was running out, and with each passing minute, David felt the knot of anxiety in his chest grow tighter. Who was after him? And how had they found him? But more importantly, what was he going to do now? Sophia hated him, the whole town was beginning to look at him with suspicion, and the threat of someone seeking revenge was growing ever closer. Victor felt as if he were at a crossroads. Never before in his life had he felt so vulnerable, so exposed. He had tried to escape his past, seeking redemption through anonymity and a new identity, but the past had caught up with him. He couldn't escape who he was, nor what his family had done. Isolated in his cabin, with no one to trust, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, anger, sadness, regret, but most of all, fear. Fear consumed him, a fear that went beyond the threat of physical violence or death. It was the fear of facing judgment from those around him, the fear of confronting himself and recognizing that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't different from his family. Maybe he was born to be like them. "I'm not like them," he muttered to himself, though even he wasn't convinced. Sophia's voice echoed in his head, over and over, "You're just like them." That statement was worse than any physical threat. The contempt in her gaze, the disappointment, were what tortured him the most. The man he wanted to be, the man he desired to become, had been crushed by the revelation of his true identity. After an endless, dark night, with the first light of dawn creeping through the cabin window, Victor made a decision. He knew he couldn't keep running, from the town, from his problems, or from the truth. He had to face it all. And that started with Sophia. Even though he knew she hated him, despised him for what his family had done to her, he had to talk to her. He couldn't let their last conversation be one filled with anger and betrayal. He needed to explain his truth, his internal struggle, and accept whatever consequences might follow. He dressed quickly, with an overwhelming sense of urgency, but also with a certainty he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew this was the right step, the only right step. Despite the fear and vulnerability he felt, he could no longer be a coward. The town, though peaceful that morning, seemed to have a different air. The people who once greeted him with smiles now looked at him with suspicion. Rumors about his identity had begun to circulate, and the shadow of the Reed name was starting to taint his reputation in the place that had once welcomed him. When he arrived at Sophia's house, his heart was racing. He hesitated for a moment, his hand halfway raised to knock on the door. What if she threw him out again? What if she didn't give him the chance to speak? But he couldn't think about that anymore. He had to try. He knocked. The seconds that followed felt like an eternity. Finally, Sophia opened the door, and as soon as their eyes met, the coldness and hardness in her gaze told him that nothing had changed. She still hated him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice so icy that Victor felt a shiver run down his spine. "I need to talk to you, please," he replied, his voice cracking slightly. "Just give me a few minutes. And if after that you still want me to leave, I will." Sophia stared at him for what felt like an eternity, but finally, she nodded and stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The atmosphere inside the house was thick with tension. Sophia didn't say a word, she simply sat on the small living room sofa, arms crossed, clearly unwilling to yield any emotional ground. Victor remained standing in front of her, unsure of how to begin. Everything he wanted to say seemed inadequate for the pain he knew he had caused. But he could no longer hold back. "Sophia, what happened at the party was terrible," he began, swallowing hard to calm his nerves. "I know. And I understand why you feel like I betrayed you, because I did." His voice cracked at the end, but he pressed on. "But what I need you to understand is that I'm not like my family. I've been fighting this truth for months. I ran away from them because I couldn't bear what they were doing, what we've done. And I didn't come near you to hurt you, I came because I wanted to be better." Sophia looked at him, but not with the softness he remembered. Now there was hardness, disbelief, and deep pain. "How can you say that?" she replied, her voice low but filled with bitterness. "You came here with a false identity, knowing full well what your family had done to me. You looked me in the eye every day, let me trust you, when all the while you were hiding who you were." Sophia took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was tinged with deep sadness. "You're no different from them, Victor. You hid, just like they hide their crimes. You're no different. You're just afraid to face what your family really is." Those words devastated him. The very thought he had been trying to drown out inside himself, the fear that, in the end, he wasn't different from his father, was now laid bare in front of him, by the person who mattered most to him. But he wasn't going to give up so easily. "You're partly right," he said, lifting his gaze to meet hers. "I've been running, I've been hiding. But I'm not like them, Sophia. I want to be better. And part of being better is facing all of this. That's why I'm not leaving, even though I know I should. I'll stay here and face the consequences of what I've done, whether that means you never forgive me or that my family, or whoever is threatening me, finds me." Sophia watched him, and though her expression didn't show any sign of softening, Victor felt that at least she was listening to him. "I want to face what I've done," he continued. "And I want you to give me a chance to show that I can change. I'm not asking you to forgive me now. I just want you to know that I'll try. That I won't leave without making things right, even if it's already too late." Silence filled the room. It was a critical moment. Victor's words had come from the deepest part of his being, his last chance for redemption, if not for Sophia, then at least for himself. He knew there was no turning back. All he could do now was wait for her response, accepting whatever she decided. After what felt like an eternity, Sophia finally spoke, and her words were like a sentence. "I can't forgive you now," she said, her voice firm but laced with pain. "I don't know if I ever can. But if you really want to change, you have a lot to prove. And not just to me." Victor nodded slowly, understanding the weight of those words. It was the beginning of a long, painful battle. He knew he wouldn't win Sophia back with a simple apology, and he probably never would. But at least he had been honest, and that was more than he had done in months. With the hardest conversation of his life now behind him, Victor left Sophia's house feeling a strange mix of relief and hopelessness. He had taken the first step toward facing the truth, but the path to redemption was full of obstacles, and he wasn't sure he would be able to cross it. But there was no time to dwell on his internal dilemma. The clock was still ticking, and the anonymous threat he had received had not disappeared. He had less than 48 hours to leave the town, and he had no idea who was behind that warning. Back at his cabin, Victor decided he wouldn't run. He couldn't keep escaping from his problems. If someone was coming after him to settle scores for his family's crimes, he would face them. He knew this was not just a test of his courage but a crucial part of his redemption. He could no longer hide, from his family, from Marcus, or from the ghosts of the past that haunted him. However, he wasn't prepared for what was to come. That night, when the silence of the countryside had settled over the town and only the wind broke the tranquility, a dark shadow appeared outside his cabin. Victor was sitting at his small table, still thinking of Sophia, when he heard a loud knock at the door. The sound made him jump to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. Cautiously, he approached the door. He hadn't expected the threat to materialize so quickly. Fear surged within him, but he suppressed it. He had to face whatever came, no matter the cost. He opened the door slowly, expecting to find Marcus or an emissary from his father. But what he saw was much worse. Standing in front of him were two men dressed in black, their faces unreadable, and in their hands, they held what appeared to be a lethal warning. One of them spoke, his voice deep and decisive. "Victor Reed. We've come to collect the debt your family left behind." Before he could react, the first blow landed in his stomach, causing him to double over in pain. The two men weren't there to talk. They were there to fulfill the threat he had received days ago. Victor tried to fight back, but he was outnumbered and overpowered. The blows rained down on him mercilessly, pain spreading through his body as they dragged him to the ground. The last image he had before losing consciousness was the man who had spoken leaning over him, a cruel smile on his lips. "The Reed's time is over." And then, everything went black. The morning silence enveloped the cabin as Victor Reed, or David Miller as he had been known in that small town, woke up. The time had come to face his fate, and although his body felt exhausted, his mind was finally clear. The fear that had haunted him for so long had begun to dissipate, replaced by a determination he hadn't felt before. He could no longer run from his past, and with every step he took, he felt the weight of his decisions, but also the freedom that came with facing the truth. The conversation with Sophia still echoed in his mind. Her rejection had been painful, but in that rejection, there was something that had made him wake up. Sophia hadn't forgiven him, nor had she given him an immediate chance at redemption, but she had left him with an open window, the possibility of proving, through his actions, that he was different. That he could change. That small crack in his sentence was all he needed to take the next step. The decision: do what's right. After everything that had happened, Victor knew the real enemy wasn't his family or the threats surrounding him, it was himself. For years, he had lived under the protection of his surname, his status, and when he discovered the truth behind the Reed Empire, his first reaction had been to run. But now he understood that true courage didn't lie in running from the shadows of his past but in confronting them, even if it meant losing everything he once knew. He didn't want to be remembered as the son of a corrupt magnate. He wanted to be someone capable of righting the wrongs his family had inflicted, even if it was too late. Even though the damage was already done, he knew it wasn't too late to try to make amends. With this thought clear in his mind, Victor began working on what he knew would be the only way to atone for his sins, bringing to light everything his family had done. The fraudulent contracts, the illegally acquired properties, the shady deals that had stripped people like Sophia and her family of everything they once had. This wouldn't be a quick or easy process, but it was the right thing to do. It was his only chance at redemption, even if no one else saw it that way. He wasn't doing it to be forgiven by Sophia or to restore his image in the town. He was doing it because, for the first time in his life, he felt the need to be honest with himself. With the help of his legal contact, Victor began gathering all the necessary evidence. He sifted through old documents, searched for hidden information, and slowly pieced together the case that would expose the Reeds. For weeks, he worked in silence, maintaining as much discretion as possible. He knew that once he made it public, his family would know, and the repercussions would be inevitable. This was the risk he was willing to take. The process drained him mentally and emotionally. Each new document he reviewed reminded him of the damage his surname had caused. Seeing his father's signature and other family members' names on papers representing the ruin of hundreds of people consumed him, but it also fueled him. Victor didn't want his life to continue being a symbol of destruction. He wanted to turn it into an act of justice, however small it might be. He knew that, in many cases, he wouldn't be able to return what had been taken, but at least he could ensure that his family wouldn't continue to oppress others. It was a battle for the truth, and though justice would be slow, at least he could expose it. Sophia, meanwhile, had kept her distance. Their relationship remained broken, and though he had hoped to see her again, he knew he couldn't force anything. She needed her own time to heal, and although a part of him wished the redemption he sought could help rebuild their relationship, he understood that his path couldn't depend on what she decided. His redemption had to be for himself and for the people affected by his family. Finally, the day came. Victor had gathered everything necessary to expose his family's crimes. He knew that once he did, his life would change forever. The Reed name, once synonymous with power and prestige, would crumble alongside its reputation. The consequences were inevitable, and Victor no longer feared what that meant. What he feared most was that he hadn't done it sooner, that he hadn't taken this path long ago. That morning, as he prepared to face the authorities and the media, a strange sense of peace settled over him. It wasn't the peace of someone who knows everything will be fine, but the peace of someone who has stopped running, who has decided to face his life head-on, with no more deception, no more lies. For the first time, Victor felt free. The town was calm as he left his cabin. There were no more whispers around him, no more judgmental looks. Everything seemed frozen in time as he walked toward the inevitable. He knew that many in the town already knew his story, that they had already heard the rumors about his family, but he also knew that after today, those rumors would no longer be mere stories without evidence. The truth would come to light. When he arrived at the small office where he had summoned the media and the authorities, Victor felt the air lighten, as if the weight of the Reed family's secrets was finally about to be lifted. He entered the building with his head held high, his face showing a serenity he hadn't felt in a long time. The revelation was clear and direct. The journalists listened intently, and every document Victor presented was a direct blow to the empire his family had built on foundations of corruption and lies. The evidence was irrefutable, and as he spoke, it was as if the last chains binding him to his past were breaking. When he finished, a heavy silence filled the room. The journalists were frantically taking notes, and the cameras recorded every second, but Victor knew the most important thing had already happened: he had kept his promise. He hadn't run. He had faced his truth. The days that followed the revelation were strange. Life in the town continued, but something had changed. People no longer looked at him the same way. He wasn't the man who had come running from his family, nor was he the man they had despised for his past. Now, he was someone who had tried to make things right where he could. Sophia remained distant, and though Victor longed to see her again, he didn't push. He knew forgiveness wouldn't come quickly, if it ever came at all. But something more important had happened. Victor had begun to forgive himself. He had accepted his responsibility and had acted accordingly. Over time, the investigations progressed. The Reed empire began to crumble. His family, once untouchable, now faced serious charges and the possibility of losing everything they had built. Victor knew his life would never be the same, but he didn't regret it. The price of truth was worth more than any luxury or power he had ever known. A few months later, as he walked through the countryside near his cabin, Sophia appeared on the path. Her face was more relaxed than the last time he had seen her, though it still showed the emotional scars of everything she had been through. They didn't exchange words at first, they simply walked side by side in silence, as if both understood that words weren't always necessary. Finally, Sophia stopped and looked at him. Her eyes no longer held the same resentment as before, but there was no immediate forgiveness either. "You did what you said you would," she said softly, looking at him with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "I don't know if that changes everything, but," she paused. "I'm glad you did it." Victor nodded slowly, understanding that this was the most he could hope for. "And it was enough." "I didn't do it for me," he replied. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Sophia smiled slightly, a gesture that, though small, gave Victor hope that maybe, over time, the wounds could heal. He hadn't won completely, but he had changed, and that change filled him with a peace he had never known before. Finally, he had found redemption amid the ruins. Thank you for following along on this journey of emotions and redemption. If you connected with Victor Reed's story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave us a comment. What part moved you the most? And before you go, be sure to check out the next story waiting for you on the screen. I guarantee it'll hook you from the very first moment. See you in the next chapter.